Good evening. Just moments ago, I spoke with George W. Bush and congratulated him on becoming the 43rd President of the United States. And I promised him that I wouldn't call him back this time. I offered to meet with him as soon as possible so that we can start to heal the divisions of the campaign and the contest through which we've just passed. Almost a century and a half ago, Senator Stephen Douglas told Abraham Lincoln, who had just defeated him for the presidency, "Partisan feeling must yield to patriotism." I'm with you, Mr. President, and God bless you. Well, in that same spirit, I say to President-elect Bush that what remains of partisan rancor must now be put aside, and may God bless his stewardship of this country. Neither he nor I anticipated this long and difficult road. Certainly neither of us wanted it to happen. Yet it came, and now it has ended, resolved as it must be resolved through the honored institutions of our democracy. Over the library of one of our great law schools is inscribed the motto, "Not under man, but under God and law." That's the ruling principle of American freedom, the source of our democratic liberties. I've tried to make it my guide throughout this contest, as it has guided America's deliberations of all the complex issues of the past 5 weeks. Now the U.S. Supreme Court has spoken. Let there be no doubt, while I strongly disagree with the court's decision, I accept it. I accept the finality of this outcome, which will be ratified next Monday in the Electoral College. And tonight, for the sake of our unity as a people and the strength of our democracy, I offer my concession. I also accept my responsibility, which I will discharge unconditionally, to honor the new president-elect and do everything possible to help him bring Americans together in fulfillment of the great vision that our Declaration of Independence defines and that our Constitution affirms and defends. Let me say how grateful I am to all those who supported me and supported the cause for which we have fought.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. I am he, Michael Brooks. This is Left is Best headquarters, and we are ready with super producer Matt Leck.
Hello.
Chief economist David Griscom.
How's it going?
Super producer David Slavic, roaming the digitosphere in the ever-growing, ever-expanding, ever-aggressive TMBS universe. On this week's program, Malaika Jabali on the color of economic anxiety, what Milwaukee African-American voting patterns tell us about the collapse of the Democratic Party, the corporate portrayal of the working class, and how to build a truly multiracial social democracy in America. She's coming in studio. We're breaking it down. Plus a new segment, The Global Brief. We're talking Iran as sanctions kick in. The Trump administration's tearing up of the most successful diplomatic achievement of the modern era. We're talking about that, the real effects on Iranian citizens. A Brazilian general admits that they threatened the Supreme Court to keep Lula da Silva in prison as Jair Bolsonaro appoints a former general as defense minister and takes aim at higher education and a goodies wish list, a gift bag of austerity for Western corporations and neoliberals, plus the Amazon travesty. Griscom's taking it on, and we're throwing a certain tall, big-headed mayoral doofus into the gulag. That's in the post game. And we're talking about how we can reclaim our politics more broadly. Arrests in Georgia as lawmakers fight there to save democracy. Bill Nelson is hanging tough in Florida. It's the anniversary of Cameron owning Bill O'Reilly. We want to honor that, of course. We have a Regulate with Matt Leck, and we also want to preemptively apologize. Much love to Stan Lee, but none of the three of us know anything about him. So that's going to be it. Peace and love to Stan Lee. But first, we got to get started with this. Voter suppression is a main vehicle of Republican power and dominance in American politics. The one smart move that Democrats in the House have announced in the past couple of days after the decent results in the midterm elections is that they're going to be calling for national voting rights legislation. The only smart and necessary move so far. Voter suppression, of course, has a profound and continuous history of this in this country. For most of our history, of course, people of color and women were not allowed to vote, period. Non-landowning whites were not allowed to vote for quite some time as well. And going back to the 2000 election, where George W. Bush won an election that he lost with the assistance of the Supreme Court, it defines the politics of our modern era. I want to take a brief trip down memory lane here and be what I would call necessarily petty. This is a clip from the day after the 2000 election. The election, of course, was in dispute, and the Bush campaign, along with his brother, the then governor of Florida, Jeb Bush, and the highly crazy Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, were setting about a strategy to make sure not all votes were counted in Florida, just as Rick Scott and DeSantis are attempting to do in Florida today. And this is a then Congressman Joe Scarborough, not a member of the hashtag resistance, not a Starbucks swilling egomaniac, but a Gingrich Republican egomaniac.
How many dead men voted in Florida yesterday, and how do we know?
I can report to you, and I've got the information here, that all the dead men and all the convicted felons voted for Bob Wexler. And I think you got like 75%. Congratulations on that, by the way. Those are two good constituencies. But you know, again,
Bill,
you could say this about any state. But let's just wait and see how it returns.
I was beginning, Joe, to respect your demeanor because this is a serious issue. Let's not play politics and let's not play games.
I was just joking with you, Bob. Don't lose your sense of humor tonight.
Lesson: Joe Scarborough, obviously always a dick. But in fact, the Republicans were always playing politics and always playing games, which is how they steal elections. Let's talk about some of those politics and games. In Georgia, Jack Kemp, the Secretary of State, oversaw his own election. He halted 53,000 voter registrations. 70% of those were likely people of color using a faulty auto match system. On the day of voting, he accused Democrats of hacking his campaign without any evidence, a tactic he's used before in the past. He purged many off of the voter rolls. Along with that, there were significant errors and lines at the polls and the shutting down of polling stations, all in a concerted effort to block mainly people of color from voting for his opponent, or voting generally, in fact. In North Dakota, there was an attack on Native American voters upheld in the Supreme Court by an empowered Republican majority with Brett Kavanaugh. A new voter ID law in North Dakota required a residential address, and many Native Americans who reside in reservations use P.O. boxes. Therefore, they were unable to vote. In Florida, we're going into a mandatory recount. Rick Scott, without a shred of evidence, has accused Democrats of attempting to steal the election. In Broward County, a largely Democratic county, around 25,000 votes were counted as blank for the Senate race, a significant number. Some believe that this was because the ballot line for the Senate race was placed underneath a long list of text obscuring the place to vote. Florida Senator Nelson's lawyers have contended that machine errors caused many of these votes not to be counted. And there were significantly other irregularities in Florida. Voters fortunately voted to restore the voting rights of felons, but they were not restored in time for this election. Voter suppression is something the left needs to take seriously, because fundamentally we are talking about democracy in the fullest sense. And we are talking about the capacity to build a left coalition, which will rest on the ability of everyone to participate in a political process, whether, of course, we're talking about the right of assembly, the right to protest, longer-term organizing, but certainly also the right to vote. The Republican Party has presided over a strategic assault on access, gerrymandering. The Roberts Court gutted the Voting Rights Act. Voter ID laws and added restrictions on voting target people of color and young people. And even in Democratic-controlled areas like New York, the ballot has plenty of problems, and there are serious difficulties in voting and reforms that are necessary. Along with attempts to suppress the vote, we've allowed our electoral infrastructure to crumble. Every election, we hear stories of untrained poll workers providing faulty information, major issues with polling machines, which is why, by the way, we're predominantly controlled by, predominantly controlled by 3 private companies. That's right, 3 private companies own most of the voting machines we're voting on. We need to fix election laws so we can vote in a orderly, universal, and civil rights guaranteed manner. The structure of our political system has a significant bent against people. We have all know about how the Electoral College, of course, has led to 2 Republican presidents becoming president while losing a majority of the votes since 2000. We also know that the power of the Senate is entirely disproportionate between populations and favors smaller, whiter, more rural states dominated by even more narrow corporate interests. In 2000, the election in Florida was no doubt compromised by electoral practices and a Supreme Court that literally invoked the 14th Amendment, one guaranteeing civil rights, one guaranteeing equal rights under the law, a prime force of civil rights and equality in this country, something that Republicans on the court have done everything to undermine. They used to suggest that a lack of uniformity in voting standards would violate George W. Bush's civil rights under the 14th Amendment. This is literally the case they wrote. They also wrote in the case, the 5-4 Republican majority, that the reasoning in this case should not be used for further cases. This was a one-off to steal a presidential election. And of course, this is a country where political and economic decisions are often made by people who are unaccountable to the public will. This fight against voter suppression and for true equality in the voting process is inseparable from a broader struggle for economic democracy and broader stakeholder equality and justice across the country. We know that in order to get people out, and in order to sustain the types of victories we're talking about, we need more people engaged. Republicans know that too, and that's why they've set out strategically and relentlessly to limit that engagement. And that's why it's entirely inseparable from the Trump administration's ethnic cleansing of America through its immigration policies. It's entirely inseparable from the conspiracy theory, right-wing nutosphere of voter fraud and a broader effort to close, limit, and block democracy, indeed to put democracy in chains so that capitalism can be unbridled with zero accountability. A fight for voting rights can be the first step into a broader fight for true democracy, where people have not only the ability to exercise their vote in the political and civic sphere, but in the economic one as well. Let's get to it. All right, guys, anything you want to add in on this as we return?
Yeah, I would just add that there's a very significant political opportunity that we have here on the left to make these contradictions very clear. And that if we're supposed to be a democracy, if we're supposed to be a country that's ruled by the will of the people, making that demand that the people's voice isn't being heard, making the point that the voting system is ridiculously difficult, there's impediments, and there are outright attempts to steal elections in this country is a really great wedge issue in the United States. And more in this country, people are feeling more and more powerless and more feeling that we are living in a crisis of democracy. It's very clear that the answer to the crisis of democracy is more democracy. And to make that demand very clear, that like the founding myths and the founding ideas of this country, that we say, wait a second, these are not being held up as the left, and that we make those demands to extend like the glorious ideas of a republic or a democracy into their actual form, rather than the kind of very plutocratic system that has been developed over the past 200 years.
Right, and don't concede. Pussy Al Gore. Matt.
I would like to co-sign Griscom's comments on the extension of those liberties that we at least say we agree with. Also, I'm just struck with seeing young Joe Scarborough like that. And thinking of all of the sort of younger conservatives that I've been harassing on Twitter for the last 3 years, and knowing that in 10 years from now they're going to be invited into probably cable shows to ask, be like, well, Florida's gone now. What does that mean for the GOP? I'll be like, well, I think we need to do this and that, and act like responsible adults. I mean, man, it's
right. The same people are getting their start now posting 4chan memes
Kavanaugh,
and supporting fascism.
Kavanaugh was in the Brooks Brothers riot.
Explain the Brooks Brothers riot.
Oh, I can't.
I should say this. We are preparing an illicit history, which is going to drop soon for patrons on the Florida election and what put George W. Bush in office. And if you look at it objectively, people use, I think now it's becoming more widespread, right? Samantha Power even said, if I was ambassador to the United Nations and someone gave me the conditions of voting in Georgia about, a foreign country, I would demand that there be hearings on it, right? Now, of course, she might add if they were also not an ally of the United States, but whatever. That being said, that's become sort of more broadly recognized. But if you go back to Florida, the fact that this happened in front of all of us in a way that was an objective, a presidential candidate's brother presides over a state where there's a disputed election. It's clear from all indications that if all ballots were voted clearly and fairly, Al Gore would be president, would win Florida. The ballot counting is stopped by a Supreme Court who is a supposedly conservative states' rights court, overruling a state court in Florida, evoking the 14th Amendment, which they always don't want to use for anything substantive. Of course, we never want to use that for civil rights, to stop a vote count in its tracks so that George W. Bush is installed as president. And of course, 16 years later or 18 years later can be seen dancing with Ellen DeGeneres. With a couple of global invasions, torture regimes, economic meltdown, environmental catastrophe, and Katrina thrown in between. And that's how we do things.
Yeah,
and that's also why fuck Joe Scarborough and have a little bit of historical awareness, people.
Yeah, these people are bad for their whole lives, turns out. It's just some other, I think there's a few more people in this Brooks Brothers riot, but Roger Stone, of course.
Roger Stone,
Matt
Brett Kavanaugh.
Who
Matt Schlapp.
Yeah,
Wow.
we had on the list a Mercedes Schlapp. His wife is also a RNC person, and I think those people are, I get a strong Nazi vibe from them. Like the way he was talking to Michael Steele about how he should accept being called that he was just RNC chair because he was black.
Yeah, it's like, why are you so offended?
Yeah, he was. But anyway, yeah, that's what struck me is these people, they last, and then they just mature into apparently respectable parts of our media environment.
That's exactly right. All right, well, let's get to something on the completely opposite end of things. Let's get to the shout out, which I see, Matt, you very helpfully put up on screen for me. But first, we have the great DJ Danerky, who's the beat maker and the mega genius, mega producer behind all of the rich sonic life of the TMBS experience. The shout out music, please. Let's get to the shout out.
Shout out, shout out. Creepy. Shout out, shout out, shout out. Weird. I think that's creepy. It's incredible. Shout out, shout out, shout out, shout out. This is crazy. Shout out, shout out, shout out, shout out. This is out of control. Shout out, shout out.
The city of Baltimore has become the first major city to ban water privatization. We have a statement here from Rihanna Eckel. She's a Maryland organizer for Food and Water Watch. This is a little bit of a tricky angle for me. Baltimore voters made history by voting in favor of passing Question E, a city charter amendment that bans the privatization of the city's water and sewage systems. This is from a report I don't know the site. The Baltimore City Council voted unanimously to ban water privatization early this year. As of 11:15 p.m., Baltimore voters voted 77% in favor of this amendment, with 91% of precincts reporting. This confirms that Baltimore is now the first major city in the country to amend its charter to prohibit the sale and lease of the city's water and sewage systems. With water corporations circling around Baltimore over the past several years and ramped up privatization ploys last spring, and a federal administration hell-bent on propping up corporate power over people's rights. It's momentous that this city has voted to keep its water public, said Rihanna Eckel, a Maryland organizer for Food and Water Watch. This is part of a report in, what's the site here? Food and Water Watch. This is their site. So props to them, props to the city of Baltimore, and how the hell has not every single city and municipality and town and hamlet and village in the country not already passed this?
You know, we talked to Matt Chrisman about sewer socialism.
Yes, we did.
Like water pipe socialism and your kid isn't going to be lead poisoned socialism is probably a pretty potent form of socialism.
Indeed.
I agree. And, I also have to say, these kind of initiatives were so important in these midterm elections too, because oftentimes, politicians are the ones who are standing behind, policies that are incredibly popular. We saw lots of really great ballot expansions, as we saw in Idaho, for example, with Medicaid expansion and across the country.
Definitely.
So it's definitely something that's very exciting to see.
There's a lot of great, the success. I mean, first, just to jump in real quick, Rashida Tlaib, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, we got some great sound of them. We're going to play for patrons in the postgame. Ilan Omar, I believe her name is, from Minnesota. She endorsed BDS today. There's great energy coming into Congress, but the picture, for being realistic federally, was mixed. I think it was decent, but it was mixed. But across the board, in terms of local initiatives and ballot measures, that's where you can really start to see that actual left momentum for reclaiming the commons, giving everybody health care, and actually also, even in places like Houston, some serious reforms in the criminal justice system. So, I agree with you, David, that down ballot could not be more important. We're going to go do a segment in a second called The Global Brief, but first we have a couple of pitches we want to talk to you guys about before we test out this new segment. And I guess, we could bend some. Yeah, it's perfect. So guys, we continue to grow on Patreon. We had a little bit of a fall off at the end of this month, and things have been a little bit mixed going in. Look, at the end of the day, we're doing great. We have a lot of people supporting us, and we've been able to grow and do what we want to do. But the next goal, which we're about 300 shy of, is 2,000 patrons. We've got to hit that goal to make some things happen as soon as possible, including the Food Bucket Challenge. So if you haven't yet, step up, become a patron at patreon.com/TMBS, patreon.com/TMBS. There is a whole alternative history and way of doing politics inside the Patreon. You're going to get really grounded in global politics. You're going to laugh and have a huge amount of fun with the clips and comedy bits and call-ins and Discord questions that we have in the postgame. What would you guys add about the Patreon content? In some ways, it's so much that it can be a little hard to convey to people, like, how much more show and participation you're getting.
Well, it's a very good binge resource, I think. I could imagine, if I wasn't producing them myself, sitting back and downloading about 10 straight illicit histories and just going through that. You get a global history. If you're a Majority Report listener, for instance, we don't really cover global stuff on that show as much as we do, especially in the illicits.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and from the illicit histories to different theory readings, there's just a lot of opportunities to really take a deep dive into left-wing history, politics, and philosophy. And also, we really have been able to cultivate a wonderful community of people.
Definitely. It's an amazing community.
And that's a really great resource.
Getting access to the Discord, getting access to the conversations. People have raised a huge amount of money. They've started campaigns. They've built significant community in the Discord. Over the next couple of weeks, we're going to be unlocking several illicit histories to spread out into the broader world as we sort of ramp up our next campaign here. And that's also going to be coinciding with live shows, which I'm going to talk about in a second. And I haven't really wanted to talk about this while it's been in process, but this book that I'm writing for Zero Books is getting much closer to being finished. And when that publishes, that's obviously going to be a whole other process that will be synchronized with this as well. So we're really proud of what we're doing. And also, it's a comedy and entertainment product. It's amazing, I think, the synthesis that the team and this really amazing constellation of people that we've been able to pull around us is achieving. So please join us at patreon.com/TMBS. also, please join us February 1st at the Bell House for our first live show. So far, we have Alona Minkowski, Bhaskar Sunkara, and Trevor Bolyu, Ricky Rawls joining us. We've sold a lot of tickets. I'm not gonna lie to you guys. There's definitely still it's not like, oh, there's only 2 left, but we're selling at a very steady clip. So they could be gone sooner than you might think. And also huge amount of VIP ticket sales actually. So I would get your tickets as quickly as possible. And we're going to make this fun. We haven't designed it yet, but it isn't just going to be us doing a live show. We have one other, by the way, we also have one other crew that might be coming out for this as well. I don't want to confirm it until it's there, but there's a possibility out there. But we're going to have audience participation. We're going to put your Obama impressions to the test. We're going to do a lot of different segments. My point being is that I think it would be fun if we just went up there and did a show in front of a live audience, but that's not what it's going to be. It's going to be a couple hours, different kind of show, different kind of experience, and we'll definitely come out and say hi, and you'll also get to meet, I would say even more importantly, a bunch of other amazing people that are coming literally from all over the country.
We came out of the Mar-a-Lago summit with very high hopes.
That's exactly right. So get your ticket today. If you're a patron, there's a coupon code. It's time. And of course, there's also subscribing to the show on iTunes, going to Michael Brooks Show YouTube channel, and just continuing to seed and spread the word. Today at Trader Joe's, I was going and buying something. This guy next to me said, "Hey man, do I know you?" And I said, I don't know. Because I'm still not really used to people recognizing me on the street. And he's like, "Are you Michael Brooks?" And I said, "Yeah." "Hey man, how you doing?" He goes, "I'm a patron." And I said, "Of Majority Report of TMBS." No, I did say that. He said, "Yeah, no, I'm a patron of TMBS." And I said, "Oh, thanks, man." And I said, "How did you find the show?" And he said, "Oh, I found it through Majority Report. But to be honest, I like you a little bit better than Sam." And I was just like, let's record that and make that an Instagram story.
Yeah, the one that matters is me. I'm the only one that matters.
That's exactly what I said. Oh, shit. That was good. All right. People who aren't watching on YouTube, they need to be getting all these sound drops with the instrumentals, man. It's important. We got to figure out a way, I think, of integrating that into the show. Because the sound drops are like a whole other story.
Oh, I think during phone calls to guests, we're going to be doing that.
Yeah, we should definitely be doing that. And people who listen to the show will know what we're talking about shortly. It's okay. We have a new segment we're going to do. We're going to test out just to put a little bit of structure around it called the Global Brief, because there's obviously a lot of things that we're covering and things we will be covering not this time but in the coming weeks, like the proposal of an independent European army by Emmanuel Macron, the wet dream of MSNBC and the loathed, pretentious right-wing neoliberal of everybody else. The new series of murders in Gaza by Israeli forces, new revelations about the Khashoggi murder. But tonight we're going to focus on Brazil and Iran. First in Brazil. And we're going to keep covering these stories, in this integrated way. So Jair Bolsonaro has been, moving forward at a steady pace in anticipation of his inauguration. Appointments of extreme neoliberals at economic ministries, which will take aim at everything from getting rid of and attacking labor rights and quote-unquote pension reform, which have long been austerity and neoliberal goals in Brazil. You already see the business press, the business sector, and the Brazilian court system, of which were, of course, very helpful to Bolsonaro, and he's already promised them a pay raise. You're already seeing indications that they might have some plans to keep him in check a little bit. They want to move away from the talk of ethnic, social, and political cleansing, which, of course, they had no problem with in supporting him, and towards the specific agenda of selling off the Amazon, of taking aim at public education, of far-right austerity, which will, of course, benefit Brazilian oligarchs and Western multinationals. So that is what's happening in Brazil, even as Bolsonaro's son, as an example, has recently said he wants to get rid of all of Brazil's communists, which is what happened in Indonesia. So there are movements forming in Brazil. The leader of the landless movement said they got rid of the Brazilian military dictatorship and they'll deal with Bolsonaro too. Amazonian indigenous communities are forming responses to the Bolsonaro regime's plans with, of course, the eager participation of U.S. and Canadian corporations to destroy the Amazon, which will be a travesty for human rights and pose global environmental threat. And this also comes on the heels of new revelations about the political imprisonment of Lula da Silva, who is the most prominent political prisoner in the world. We're going to start by watching this clip from a couple of months ago from the Real News Network to help contextualize the latest news about the political imprisonment of the former two-term president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva.
President da Silva supposedly accepted a bribe from the Brazilian construction company Odebrecht while he was still president, where no evidence was actually produced of this crime. The Supreme Court's ruling does not exhaust Lula's appeal, but it probably puts an end to his presidential campaign, in which he is the front runner. The ruling was limited to whether Lula was to be imprisoned while he continued his appeal of the conviction. Both supporters and opponents of the former president hit the streets this week in tens of thousands. Also, shortly before the ruling, two generals urged the court to rule against Lula. General Luiz Gonzaga Schroeder Lesser even threatened with the possibility of a military coup should Lula be allowed to remain free.
So this was of course true, and again, Lula was convicted on a stunningly flimsy charge. Judge Sergio Moro, the politically motivated, vindictive prosecutor of Lula, has accepted a job as justice minister in the incoming fascist government of Bolsonaro. And in a newspaper interview on Sunday, November 11th, I'm quoting now from Brian Muir and Brazil Wire, General Vilas Boas gave an interview to Folha de São Paulo newspaper in which he admits to threatening the Supreme Court against issuing a decision favorable to the former president. Quote, "I recognize that there was an episode in which we really pushed the limits, which was a tweet I made on the eve of the Supreme Court vote on the issue of Lula. We were conscious. We consciously knew we were on the edge, but we felt that the situation could escape our control if I did not publicly express myself. Because other people, military reservists and citizens, identified with us and were speaking more emphatically." Responding to the interview, PT president, that's the Workers' Party, Gleisia Hoffmann, accused Vila Boas of hatching a scheme involving sectors in the media and the judiciary to remove ex-president Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva from the presidential race that resulted in the Jair Bolsonaro victory. General Vilas Boas' statements revealed a political plot against Lula. He makes it clear there was interference in the federal Supreme Court decision. We're going to continue to follow this story and Brazil generally, and we need to encourage every single self-proclaimed Democrat, frankly, but certainly anybody coming in with a progressive profile to join Bernie Sanders in condemning the political prosecution in Lula, in condemning the Bolsonaro government, and condemning U.S. corporations that have backed the fascist austerity right in Brazil, and the protection of democracy, as well as the freeing of Lula in Brazil. Now, let's move to Iran. Donald Trump fulfilled a campaign promise, a promise that I think no doubt all Republican candidates would have fulfilled, in tearing up the Iran deal. The Iran deal was, of course, the deal negotiated by the Obama administration and its European, Chinese, and Russian partners that established a rapprochement to some extent with Iran. It was working and certified by all relevant international bodies, and there was no indication whatsoever that Iran was not complying with the deal. The Trump administration brought in ancillary issues to appease their extremist base, as well as Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, in destroying this deal, and now it poses a significant threat to the world and also a huge damage to normal, everyday Iranian citizens as sanctions kick back in. Let's watch briefly this report from Al Jazeera, because it, among other things, does have some good burns from Hassan Rouhani against Donald Trump. Hassan Rouhani, of course, Iran's president. And then David Griscom is going to fill in a little bit of the details on the human stakes of the return of sanctions.
One of the reasons President Donald Trump gave to pull out of the 2015 nuclear deal and reimpose sanctions on Iran was the country's growing military influence in the Middle East.
Pause it.
And
sorry to pull a Sam here, but this had nothing to do with the agreement. The agreement was on the nuclear program, period. In fact, Republicans and other right-wing forces tried to introduce poison pills having to do with things like intermediary ballistic missiles as a way of destroying the deal when it was achieved and agreed to back during the negotiations. So this argument is an ancillary lie and it has nothing to do with the agreement. Go ahead.
Influence in the Middle East and their ballistic missiles program. So it was perhaps not a coincidence that Iranians scheduled one of their largest military exercises of the year on the same day as U.S. sanctions kicked back in. Multiple air defense units took part in war games spanning 500,000 square kilometers across the country. And as the missiles took flight, on the ground the Iranian president lobbed insults at the American president.
I don't think any other administration in the history of the United States has been as opposed to the law and international treaties. I have not seen any administration in the White House as racist as these people, and you cannot expect anything else from them.
So first of all, props to the Al Jazeera English translator with the best deadpan translation of Rouhani's very solid burns there. I just want to say, look, obviously, we can do business with Iran and we can make deals with the Iranian government. And there are even some areas of the Iranian revolution that one can have some sympathy with. And there's different aspects of the Iranian leadership. Rouhani is a very different figure than, say, an Ahmadinejad. That being said, none of this is predicated on justifying or excusing the abuses of the Iranian regime, abuses which, of course, include savage and vicious abuses of Baha'i human rights, structural misogyny, and also historically, back after in the beginning stages of the revolution, a mass killing and murder of leftists and liberals. So no sort of soft peddling of the Iranian government's abuses. That said, it does not compare to Saudi Arabia, and this agreement was a great achievement. And sanctions, and of course, even worse, the threat of war can only affect and hurt normal people. And David, you're going to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, so far, these added sanctions on Iran have been very devastating. And of course, it's always difficult to get hard numbers on these questions. But the stories that are coming out of Iran are quite tragic. Predominantly, one of the most horrific stories has been about the importation of medicine into Iran. And that's not only from American pharmaceutical companies, that's also from countries like Germany. And that's also not just when it comes to completed medicine, that also comes for many of the materials that are needed for medicine. And this is something that can be very devastating for somebody if you're on like a routine when you're taking medicine. To have it interrupted and replaced with something else can be very devastating, especially for people who are dealing with serious heart disease or mental illness. I mean, these can be serious life or death issues. You know, and just like watching this situation, it's very frustrating to see a lot of the rhetoric in the United States. It might not be of a surprise to the people in this room, but again, the IAEA, after the inspections of Iran, gave them perfect rating, that
every
passed
single
every single
certification.
time, and there's not been any kind of ratcheting up of any kind of nuclear activity. In fact, we can go back to the Iran deal, and it was an achievement in bringing Iran into the global community, but it was a very punitive deal for a country that, when you really start looking into like the actual allegations against their nuclear program, aren't as
never any proof that Iran even had a weapons program.
Exactly,
and,
that's something that's
Iran's that's a really important point. So I just want to elaborate for a second. Under NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, there was this, goes back to the 60s or maybe even the 50s, this idea of atoms for peace. Now, I have my own innate concerns about nuclear power, frankly, from an environmental and public health standpoint. I know that there's plenty of debate about that, but I have a lot of concerns. Being that as it may, the notion of that original agreement was that all countries would be incentivized to not develop weapons programs, but would be supported in the peaceful use of that technology for energy. And of course, nuclear power is definitionally dual use. It's all the same stuff, and it has to do with speeding up of fuel cycles, which was what makes it weapons grade. All available serious evidence, not cooked books from neoconservative think tanks or Israeli or Saudi intelligence, there was never, ever any clear, let alone definitive evidence. There was some speculative evidence, and frankly, it would make a lot of sense why Iran would want that capacity from the perspective of its own self-preservation. But no evidence, including U.S. CIA intelligence estimates, ever demonstrated that Iran was on the path to a weapon. That has never been demonstrated, ever.
Yeah. And it's something that's very important to remember when we're talking about the very serious human cost.
That's right.
So in addition to the medical issues, we're also seeing what's happened with sanctions has been a collapse of the rial, which is a currency in Iran, which lost over 70% of its value trading internationally since they've ratcheted up these sanctions. Not only do you have that, but now because all of America's allies are unable to process payments from Iran, global trade, for Iran is absolutely devastating. Which means that we live in a global economy now, you go to the supermarket and you look at the food that you eat, and you'll be very surprised to find out that a lot of it doesn't come from America. And it's not a surprise that a country as populous and as wealthy as Iran, which is 81 million people, imports food as well. And that's something that is also being restricted, which will have very significant consequences. And let's not forget that Pompeo, of the Trump administration, said recently in an interview, Secretary of State, that the leaders of Iran would have to choose between letting their people eat or continuing to fund terrorism. So, that's the state of the discourse right now. And even though
the same strategy against Venezuela, which they're also threatening regularly as well.
100%. And just, one more added point is, even though a lot of European powers are very upset with the United States for their actions, because of the immense financial power of the United States, private corporations and private companies are having a lot of difficulty, even if their nations might want to defy or push back against Trump's blustering barbarity. And it's just something that we really need to pay a lot of attention to, and to not let this kind of rhetoric get ratcheted up. Don't forget.
And this needs to be another talk about litmus test for Democratic presidential candidates in 2020. Are you going to try to save and restore the Obama-Iran deal? Well, it has to be non-negotiable.
And the fact is that you talk about this, and people forget that there's politics in Iran too. That's right. And you have someone who's like a moderate, like Rouhani, right, who's been in power for a little while now. It's coming up. They're going to have a new president in 2021. And you imagine, a new Iranian president coming up and having to sit at the table and try to negotiate a new deal with the United States after we backed out, even though Iran did nothing to trigger that backing out.
The supreme leader said specifically back in 2014, he said, "You have my permission to negotiate, but you should never trust the United States." He literally inculcated himself and actually essentially projected out what happened.
And it's like, even from the Trump administration's idiotic, strategy, this is the worst strategy ever, because all that it's done has really empowered the hardliners,
of course,
in Iran, and that's something.
But maybe that's what people like John Bolton want, because they're warmongers, which is a very terrifying and serious thing you have to, because the reality is that, there is always the reality that, the hardliners in Iran and Likud in Israel and the neocons here and the Saudi even more aggressive contingent, the mass murder contingent of MBS and so on. They always have the convergence of interest. But yes, I thank you. So we have to go. Actually, we're staying right on David Griscom as he swigs his beer, gets into mode here. There was actually, before we do this, let's play this sound, because there was announced today. If you're an idiot and you're a resident of Virginia or New York, you'd be really excited that two states supplicated them, that just sort of literally bent the knee. This actually was an almost sort of feudal, medieval feudalism, sort of fused with reality TV show pageantry, in a process of states trying to beg and bribe one of the most predatory and dangerous corporations on planet Earth to come to their states and hand out some, what will almost certainly be some extremely punitive and abusive jobs. And Amazon confirmed they're coming to Virginia and Jesus Christ, Queens, New York. They're going to ruin the subway. We need to do everything we can to block this deal if you're in New York. And if you're in Virginia, too. I just don't know much about it. But I do know that Ralph Northam, the governor of Virginia, is a mega cuck. And this is his video thanking Amazon. This is maybe one of the most pathetic things I have seen from a public official. And I have to say, as far as the Democratic Party brand goes, the symmetry here between Al Gore being like, and while I strongly reject the Supreme Court stealing the election from me, but as, you know, Senator Thaddeus said in the 18th century, government goes on. I see a little bit of a theme here with Ralph Northam in this pathetic homage to Amazon.
Hello. I'm Virginia Governor Ralph Northam. I'm proud to announce a big win for Virginia. Amazon has selected the Commonwealth as home to a major new headquarters. Earlier this year, Virginia put together a proposal to Amazon that we believe represents a new model of economic development for the 21st century. And I'm excited to say that our innovative approach was successful. The vast majority of Virginia's incentive package represents smart investments in our education and transportation infrastructure. Amazon will invest more than $2 billion to deepen its roots in the Commonwealth, lay ground on a new headquarters, and create thousands of jobs. This is the result of an unprecedented state, local, and regional partnership that includes our neighbors in Maryland and the District of Columbia. As a result of our coordinated efforts, all of Virginia will see the benefits. We are proud that Amazon has recognized the tremendous amount Virginia has to offer. One of the strongest tech pools in the nation, a world-class higher education system, and a stable, competitive business climate. Virginia is an inclusive state, and we want everyone to feel welcome here, no matter your religion, nationality, or orientation. I'm proud to welcome Amazon to its new home here in the Commonwealth. Thank you so much.
So, David, after you saw that clip, is this going to affect your segment? Do you want to give a little bit more credit for the Amazon deal?
Well,
because now, of course, we are taking that segment of Ralph Northam being a mega cuck for Amazon, and we're transitioning to the GEM system. That is the David Griscom Economic Minute.
Well, I mean, this is very clear that this is what democracy doesn't look like. Yeah, you know, what Megan Dea Jacobin rightfully called the Hunger Games of Amazon are finished. And just to give people the context of this, you know, around 28% of the American population lived in a city, state, or municipality which was involved in this competition, which is, you know, a very incredible amount of folks when you think about it. And of course, they chose the two most likely candidates that you could expect for Amazon to pick. Washington, D.C., is Crystal City, Virginia, which, and Long Island City and Queens, New York. You know, that was pretty much what everyone thought they were going to do up front. So let's talk about what they did. Amazon basically got detailed plans, economic pitches, and updates from around 28% of the America's population for free, which means that, I mean, seriously, like incredible, like architecture firms provided, schematics of proposed headquarters to Amazon for free, which were paid for by state and local governments. And again, they took those two most likely candidates. Now, why did they do this? Amazon got huge tax breaks and subsidies from their new homes because New York and Virginia felt like they were winning something by bringing Amazon into their community.
What are we winning, bro?
Well,
what are we winning?
We're winning a devastating increase in housing prices.
Right.
Increased stratification of wealth in two areas which have huge stratifications of wealth already.
But I have a question.
Yes.
What proximity will the new Amazon headquarters have to public housing projects?
Oh, there can
just from like a synergy point of view.
There's going to be a lot of synergy between the largest corporation, and we'll talk about that later in our Gulag section.
Yes, we will.
But I just want to hit real quick a couple of these numbers, because I'm going to tell you something that surprised you. Remember that blubbering idiot that we were just listening to? He actually ended up getting a better deal than Andrew Cuomo. When it comes down to it, New York is going to basically be giving $2.5 billion in tax breaks and subsidies to Amazon, while Virginia, even though they are going to be changing the name of Crystal City to National Landing, they're getting a rebrand of the neighborhood. Yeah, so they're going to change the name. So that might be
Crystal City to National Landing.
National Landing.
What the fuck kind of name upgrade is that?
So New York's going to be giving them about $1.2 billion from the state Excelsior tax credit, around $300 million from the state capital grant, and New York City is going to provide them with around $1 billion in tax credits through the Relocation and Employment Assistance Program. And this is a program that has not been used on this scale ever before. Now, let's not forget, by the way, that this is around 25,000 jobs that the state is that we're going to be getting over the course of the next 25 years.
Right.
And we're providing $2.5 billion. Virginia is similar, 25,000 jobs over the next 15 years. And we're talking most of those jobs aren't going to roll in for another decade. So they're going to hire around 400 people in 2019, maybe around 800 people in 2020. And then we'll see around 1,000 new hires, supposedly, year after
and are
that.
these like fulfillment center, like sweatshop jobs, or these?
No, these are
like
supposedly going to be
jobs.
high-paying jobs, around $150,000. Which, let's remember something: New York City and Washington D.C. aren't cities that are really lacking
for those jobs.
Aren't really lacking when it comes to high-paying jobs like that. What really is missing in those areas is the middle.
Right.
And I just want to make a couple things clear about these negotiations. One, Amazon of Virginia can leave within 5 days at any time in this agreement,
which would, just because of that Ralph Northam video, be pretty funny.
It would be.
They were just like, yeah, actually, this isn't going to work.
But let's remember for a second
Ralph.
that, his competition was Andrew Cuomo, somebody who said that he's going to change his name to Amazon Cuomo if need be. And you wouldn't be surprised to find a tough negotiator like that also, really stuck his foot in the ground and, ended up acquiescing to give Jeff Bezos a personal helipad launcher in Queens. But don't worry, there's a limit on how many times that the state will pay for it. It's only 120 times a year.
Oh, that's okay. So there was something.
So, I mean, this is something that was just like, I just want to hit this real quick because it's like, these decisions were not made with public input.
Right.
And because of the contradiction in our society between use value and exchange value, what you're going to see is property values rising dramatically in all these communities. And landlords do not particularly are not going to be searching out for like the bottom of this market. They're going to be searching for the top, which means that rents are going to increase across the board, and we're going to see more and more empty spaces. If you walk through Midtown Manhattan, that's something that you'll learn, right? Is that high valuation and high speculation does not necessarily flatten out the market. In fact, it'll leave storefronts empty while owners and landlords can leverage the position that they have.
Manhattan is like empty.
It's like a ghost
Dwayne
town.
Reed, Starbucks, empty.
And
some sort of like asshole bars occasionally.
Exactly. I mean, this
Dwayne
is
Reed,
it's something that's
Edison
very,
bulbs.
It's something
What'd
that's
you
very
say?
worrying.
Edison bulbs.
Definitely Edison bulbs. That's
well,
true.
maybe that'd be the one thing if Amazon could get rid of the Edison.
Yeah, if Amazon get rid of Edison bulbs
in the
that's all right.
surrounding
Come
areas,
on,
that'd be
then
a
they
good
should
thing.
come here. Yeah, that's true. I would support that. I'm just gonna. You have anything else you want to hit on that?
I just want to hit one last thing, and it's just that we need to be very wary about these kind of investments, especially when you hear a lot of talk about vocational training and coding training for the local communities, because people talk about these things as if they're going to be high-paid jobs. But what we're seeing more and more is that there's actually a surplus of people who have skills when it comes to coding in the United States, and more what these major corporations are trying to do is they're trying to create a larger reserve army of technical workers, which means that they're trying to suppress the wages.
Explain reserve army to people.
So these are people who aren't employed, but they could potentially be employed, and those are sort of used as a threat for people who are working in an environment who want to push their wages up or to get better conditions, because the threat basically being, if you quit or we fire you, there's 10 other people who want to take your job. And it's something that capitalists very much try to cultivate, because they use this competition between workers as a threat to lower wages amongst the working class. So when we see these kind of investments and the promises that we make, we really need to remember that Amazon is not a company that's really looking out for this community. Don't forget what happened this year in Seattle, where Amazon fought against a very modest head tax increase and basically poisoned the city council in Seattle. And you can definitely expect that coming to Virginia, New York. And basically this subsidized program, now we have lobbyists right next to the Capitol, subsidized by the Virginia government for Amazon. And I mean, it's an absolute disaster what we've seen and a real capitulation.
That was also an absolute disaster is what I just got texted by Richard Wolff. I didn't want to get into it. He says he will see you on the 27th.
Bring it.
You just said bring it to Richard Wolff? The guy's going to come in here and kill you. I just want to also say, I mean, there is an initiative in the New York State Senate the legislature by Assemblyman Ron Kim. This is from a report by David Sirota. Democratic Assemblyman Ron Kim has announced that he'll introduce legislation to slash New York's economic development subsidies and use the money to buy up and cancel student debt. A move, he said, would provide a bigger boost to the state's economy. The legislation, says Kim, would halt any Cuomo administration offer of taxpayer money to Amazon, which could reap up to $1 billion in tax incentives if it moves to Long Island City. Giving Jeff Bezos hundreds of millions of dollars is a moral waste of taxpayer money when it's crystal clear that the money would create more jobs and more economic growth when it would be used to relieve student debt. So that's an incredibly important initiative, and this is the type of thing that, because you got rid of the IDC and there is actually Democratic control of the state Senate, that you might be able to get some sort of momentum behind. This is also an opportunity. There was a time when Bill de Blasio was undoubtedly the best choice that you're going to get for mayor of New York City in a world of very bad choices. But this is the type of move. This guy still has pretensions for much broader leadership, even though he's like a charisma-free beanstalk. And this needs to be used to seriously tarnish his brand. And I think there's also a story that you could connect with his approach to real estate that will overlap with Amazon. His approach to real estate and housing affordability and crisis in New York has just been, well, just build massive high-rises and stick a few quote-unquote affordable units in there, most of which are definitely not affordable for working or poor people.
And they're like a closet, too.
And like a closet,
really depressing
absolutely.
Spaces.
No doubt. So I think this model of sort of like, I mean, look, sort of like corporate big government liberalism is like yoga that's bad for you. It's the worst of all worlds. And he needs to be tarnished with that brand. As we say, there might have been a time in 2013 where a dude saying inequality matters and I supported the Sandinistas in the 80s, that was actually bold and distinct on the national landscape. Not anymore. And not only is he not kept up with it and upgraded with it, he, along with Andrew Cuomo, is pimping for this Amazon deal. And that should never sort of, that should be front and center for any conversation we have on Bill de Blasio. Now, I'm about to welcome to the show in a minute somebody I like a lot more than Bill de Blasio. Significantly more than Bill de Blasio. Malaika Jabali, who is a writer, attorney and activist. She has a piece for Current Affairs, which we're going to throw up on screen in a minute, called The Color of Economic Anxiety. I think an extension out of the conversation with Bill Fletcher Jr., this conversation will really get us where we need to go in terms of that conversation and put some sort of stagnant thinking to sleep. So we're going to take a brief break, and we will be right back with Malaika Jabali on The Michael Brooks Show. Welcome back to The Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now is Malaika Jabali. She joins us in studio. She is a writer, attorney, and activist. Her piece, which we're going to throw up on screen for a second, is called The Color of Economic Anxiety. She wrote it for Nathan Robinson's blog, Current Affairs. Or Current Affairs, excuse me. Malaika, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Is that good ratio-wise, sound-wise, guys?
Yeah. Just get a little bit closer.
Just a little bit closer. Go for it again.
Thanks for having me.
Perfect. So you went to Milwaukee for this piece. Can you remind or tell everybody why? What happens in Milwaukee?
A lot of things are happening in Milwaukee, and unfortunately, most of the media hasn't reported it. A lot of the mainstream media hasn't been there and covered the economic devastation that is occurring and that has been occurring for Black Milwaukeeans for about 40 years now, primarily deindustrialization. And when we think about deindustrialization and the working class and the Midwest, particularly, and blue-collar voters, we tend to think of white people. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to write this piece to push back on that narrative, not only because it is fair and just, because we need to talk about those who are most economically devastated, but because it's the smart thing to do if we're talking about elections. And in 2016, while the pervasive narrative was that white working class voters or white conservative leaning voters flipped a lot of those states to Trump, because for instance, in Wisconsin, it went red for the first time in about 30 years for a president. However, when you look at the data, you realize that it's really a story of non-voters. 2016 was a story of non-voters. And I wanted to go down there and find out why. And it really surprised me the extent of the economic upheaval that Black people have been facing down there for decades.
So we're going to get to how the historical origins of that in a second. But that reminded me, I mean, there was that New York Times piece that came out within, I think, like a week of 2016.
Yep.
And I talked about it on Majority Report because it seemed just like this is the lane to go. Like, because even if you're talking about any voter that didn't show up or any voter that felt so betrayed by Democratic politics because of trade agreements, because of attacks on government spending, because of not campaigning in your state, that instead of like this flip of like disentangling why somebody would vote for Trump, which I think now, at least in my opinion, I mean, I don't know, most people voted for Trump are Republicans, and Republicans vote Republican. This isn't really that complicated, right?
Absolutely.
But why did the turnout depress itself? And if you look at that interview, if I recall correctly, you had a lot of people saying essentially some combination of, you know, which I think people shouldn't ignore, which is like Obama's a compelling person, so I might go out and vote for Obama as a guy, but legislatively not much was happening for me. Hillary didn't really say anything different than Obama, and she's not that compelling, so I'm not going out. And I think what you did in the piece definitely knows you went to this much broader history behind it. So can you talk, like, first of all, just bluntly, I think when people think of Wisconsin, they don't think of a particularly black place.
Yeah.
They think of a highly white place, but it is, in fact, a very African-American, very black place. How did that happen? What is the Great Migration? When did people start leaving the South to go there? And what kind of economy did that create?
So that history is very compelling. I just want to add on to what you're saying with Trump, because that is a key reason why I wanted to write this piece, because when you look at the voter data, the folks who voted for Trump was about the same ratio as those who voted for Mitt Romney and George Bush and John McCain and literally every other Republican president since Nixon. So I talk about that in the piece as well, because that to me is not really much of a story. If you are a party that serves white interests, the majority of white people tend to vote in that direction. So what's new? And so that's why Milwaukee and Wisconsin was so compelling to me, because it said something different. And part of what was so different about it is thinking of the idea of the black voter and thinking that they are a monolith. So what we saw in the Hillary campaign, and I think the general narrative around black voters is that, you know, we are in the South. This is the Democratic firewall.
Right.
And you get through them through some of these cultural appeals. Bill Clinton, as we know, used quite a bit of that when he was running in his earlier campaigns. So that's what we think about typically when we think about the black voter.
So it's like I'm ready to go to church.
Right. You go to
That type of
church, you
thing.
talk about Beyonce,
Right.
talk about Jay-Z, which is precisely what Hillary Clinton did. And if you talk to some black Milwaukeeans, like they saw right through that and they felt that it was so patronizing and they were insulted by it. So what the piece initially started off with me wanting to think about the Midwest more broadly. And it was to discuss the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of the 1967 uprising. So there was a lot of civil unrest under very similar social...
In Milwaukee.
In Milwaukee and throughout the country.
Right.
In a lot of cities where black people had migrated because they didn't see any of those civil rights gains that they had been promised. So in 67 in Watts in California, in Newark, in Detroit, in Milwaukee, all over the place, you saw these uprisings. A lot of civil unrest, and there was arson, there was, I mean, just everything that you envision when you think about, you know, what a riot or a rebellion would look like in an urban environment. So I went to Milwaukee and Detroit. So the piece was really going to be about Detroit, but I was like, everyone talks about Detroit. So let's see what's going on in Milwaukee. And that uncovered so much for me. So just pushing back again on this narrative that black people are a monolith. In the Midwest, there is such a rich tradition of anti-establishment black politics. There is a rich tradition of progressive politics, of collective bargaining. A lot of the things that we think about when we think of progressive politics was actually born in Wisconsin, and black people adopted that as well. And they were also bringing some of their own tradition coming from the Deep South, where, you know, they were escaping Jim Crow segregation and this really entrenched legal system of discrimination and terrorism. So if you've got this group of people who are already kind of anti-establishment because they're, you know, uprooting their entire lives and moving
And willing to take big risks.
Huge risk. They don't know people. They don't have
Right.
a network there for the most part. They're willing to uproot their lives. So there's already this culture of being a little bit anti-establishment. And we don't really talk about it enough. So just one more like bit on the history with that. And then I guess we could talk about the history of, you know, the economic decline.
Yeah. But first, I mean, but they're leaving because there's also the perception, and it's not all wrong. You outlined this, that actually like in the 60s and the 70s, there's the fact that it's not living up to the promise of civil rights at all, but there is actually a great job market.
Right.
And there are actually industrial jobs, and that actually feeds into working black middle class through blue collar, just like the same way that we think of with white workers in the industrial Midwest. And that also feeds again into this politics of labor, which is another difference from the South, right? Because it's like there isn't this labor union politics in the South, because they were crushed as actually part of that same apartheid economic system that people are getting away from.
Yeah, and I think a good central figure, so I framed the piece around some, you know, folks who represent different walks of life, different generations, but they are integral to the kind of cultural and political fabric of Milwaukee. And one of those men is a man by the name of Wendell Harris. And he was the former union president of the Black Trade Unionists, also a Democratic Socialist. And here's an older black dude, Democratic Socialist, and has been for years. And I think what's really interesting about that is a lot of folks in his generation came from Arkansas. So they were familiar with Bill Clinton. So there was also this Clinton, anti-New Democratic tradition that was going on at the same time, because he saw what was going on in Arkansas under Bill Clinton's governorship. He saw what the corporate tax breaks were doing. He saw what the union busting was doing in Arkansas. He was like, oh no, I'm not about that here.
Right.
And so that collective bargaining was a big part of what black men experienced in the Midwest. Black men occupied about 54% of the black male population at the time in 1970 were in manufacturing jobs versus 21% of white men in Milwaukee. So the majority of black men relied on, the manufacturing industry to make a living, where, white folks had more options. You know, the market was a little bit more diverse for them. So when you take that away from them, then you see a lot of the trends that, you know, that are occurring right now in terms of the economic impacts.
Yeah, and you quoted some incredible statistics, like at the heart of this sort of like industrial economy, black male employment in Wisconsin is higher than the national average of employment for everybody.
Yes.
And then it sinks just like catastrophically low.
Yeah, the black male jobless rate is about 50% in Milwaukee, and it's it's been at that rate for about 10 years. So since the Great Recession, basically.
I want to like compare actually Bill and Hillary Clinton, I think, in turn, because it helps your piece, I think, and sort of like understanding this conversation, at least for me, because my understanding of Bill Clinton was sort of like he was doing basically three things. That's a super Bill Clinton way of formulating, right? I was doing three things. So number one.
Was that a Bill Clinton accent I heard?
It was a little bit.
Okay.
A little bit. If I have a few more beers in me, I'll get you.
I'm ready.
I'll do the whole
We'll
post
do
game.
an SNL thing.
I'll do the whole
We'll
post game as Bill Clinton.
Okay.
Don't worry about it. So move the Democratic Party to the right, get corporate campaign contributions. And this is like coming out of the 80s and actually even Carter, right? Like they're already deregulating the airline and busing industries, and he's part of the Democratic Leadership Council, which gets all this corporate money to back trade agreements and deregulate finance and blah, blah, blah. Then on the other hand, he is actually moving, in some ways, paradoxically, more so than at least in 92. He actually did talk about things like universal health care, so there was a little bit of like a populist thing. But the other part of the populist thing was like the types of racialized politics that would shock the type of woke people you see on Twitter who stand for the Clintons all the time, right? Like the same people who, you know, if Bernie Sanders is like, yeah, you know, I use the wrong pronoun, they would be like, yeah, Bernie's canceled. These people, like Bill Clinton made it his business to go home to execute a mentally disabled black man when he was running for president to talk about welfare. I know you're going to go off on this in a second.
I'm going to try not to. I don't want to go off.
You have absolutely, you can do whatever you feel. And then at the same time, there was this other, and also to me, I think even like 20 years later, as we're adults, reads like super patronizing, like Bill Clinton's the first black president. Bill Clinton, you know, he plays the saxophone and he's cool and all of this shit. And then you fast forward to Hillary Clinton, and you actually have essentially the same sort of like political profile, but the social signaling flips. So we go from like, I'll tell you what, like here, I'll do a full one. Black people need to work, and I should, you know, and I'll play the sax for you, but you need to be a father. Mm-hmm. And then Hillary Clinton's like, it's called intersectionality. And then meanwhile, like, you know, here's Beyonce, here's intersectionality.
Yeah, some hot sauce.
No jobs.
Yeah.
Go fuck yourself.
Yeah.
And in both of those things is concealing the economics and concealing structural racism. And in both of those strategies, this type of Midwest populist African-American politics is completely negated. Is that how you'd frame it?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And that framing is essentially, I believe, what I argue is that it cost her the election. So the black vote in Milwaukee, or I should say Wisconsin generally, went from about, they lost 88,000 black voters. I'll just put it that way.
How much of that is voter suppression, just to like be fair to put that in the mix?
It's hard to tell. And I think, I mean, my argument is that at least in 2016 in Wisconsin, there's more evidence saying that it was voter disinterest over voter suppression. I think voter suppression, you know, just to back up, is obviously a key issue right now. It's critical that we get a hold of that and that we hold both Democrats and Republicans accountable for that. I'm from Georgia, so I see what's happening right now with Stacey Abrams. That kind of suppression has been happening in the South for decades. Literally, the first election that I was able to vote in, there was an intense amount of voter suppression. It was between Cynthia, I don't know if you remember, this is kind of back in the day. I'm probably a little bit older than people may think. At least I like to think I am. And we had a congresswoman named Cynthia McKinney who was running. She was like saying, you know, George
Matt
Bush
has a crush on Cynthia McKinney.
Oh, word?
I'm not sure if you're.
You don't even know what she looked like.
No, she does.
Okay. So
I know what she looks like because of Matt.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's Her pictures are all around here, guys. Y'all just
It
can't
is.
see it.
It is. Matt has a shrine to Tupac and Cynthia McKinney. It's very interesting. I'm sorry to put your business out like that. All right, go ahead.
And so she was my congresswoman,
Right.
and we saw how Republicans basically ousted her because she was the one, questioning. I think they might have talked about her in 9/11. I don't remember, but anyway, we saw this happening.
She was a little extra at times.
I mean,
but she was a good
we
congresswoman.
need people who are going to push back. So she pushed back. She was asking about, what happened with 9/11. We need to ask questions, basically. And so, because we have open, primaries in Georgia, Republicans found a way to kick her out. And
they replaced her with somebody
Denise
really
Majette,
trash, right?
Yeah, she was there for like one term, and then hasn't been heard of since. So it was clearly there to basically get Cynthia McKinney out. They needed somebody more centrist.
Got it.
So anyway, voter suppression is key. And I think we need to also be aware of when we are oppressing people who are poor, who are working class, in and out of elections. So not just in an election cycle should we be worried about people who are under oppressive conditions. We need to speak to those issues. And unfortunately, a lot of times Democrats don't do that. Or I should say mainstream Democrats don't. And that's not what happened in Wisconsin. Hillary Clinton didn't step foot in Wisconsin. Most people will tell you that after she became a nominee. She did not speak to the 50% black male unemployment. There was an uprising there in 2016 in August, just a few months before the general election.
Talk about that. What led to that? You described this really well in the piece as well.
So in a neighborhood called Sherman Park, there was a group of folks who were fed up. And the reasons for that are myriad. The match point was the killing of a young man named Sybil Smith. He was killed by a police officer, like cold blood. There are videos that circulated. And just in a few hours, the city was in flames. So I spoke with Alderman Khalif Rainey, who was there. It was his district where he saw this happening. He said it was the most chilling thing he's ever experienced in his life because it was just anarchy. He didn't know, what his neighborhood was going to look like the next day because he grew up in a neighboring district, and now this was his district. And to see it go down when, especially historically, it was there for like kind of black middle class. Like that was the Sherman Park was an area that you aspired to live in one day. And to see it decimated, he was baffled, and he also felt completely powerless. And imagine you just, you just gotten elected. This is your district, and you have absolutely no control over this because these things have been building up for decades. If you imagine, from literally just 1 hour to the next, something is completely in flames. What else is going on there? So if you are an elected official, you think you would at least ask why. And to be an elected official of a state that you need to win and you don't even step foot in that state, it speaks to, I think for a lot of people, a lack of, just no sense of like, I guess, understanding or no sense of reality about the real conditions people are experiencing.
Right. I mean, it kind of reminds me, I know I'm always going to do Brazil examples, but this actually is appropriate because I talked with a friend once about basically when they impeached Dilma Rousseff, right, who's the successor to Lula, who I'm always talking about on this show because I consider him to be a political prisoner. And I said, but do you think like if Lula was president, even with all of the corruption, all of these people gunning at the Workers' Party, would he have managed to survive? And he's like, yeah, he really probably would have. And part of it was, he showed me this clip of this interview where Lula, like in the heart of this crisis, with all this austerity happening, was like, the first thing we've got to do is to get credit and investment circulating back into like people's hands. Like, all this other stuff is noise compared to like getting the money now. And if you follow that instinct, people will come to you. So like you have all of these people in the article who get it, who are organizers, who are politicians, who are part of the party, who are part of even the NAACP, which is definitely not, in my read in modern politics, a radical force at all. So was it that the Clinton campaign not only didn't campaign there, but it didn't even have like any relationship with any of the actors on the ground there? And if so, like, is that changing at all?
from my reporting and speaking to Fred Royal, who is the president of the NAACP Milwaukee chapter, he said that her ground game was atrocious. I followed up with an interview with Angela Lang. She is executive director or president of an organization called Black Leaders Organizing for Communities. She also spoke to the lack of real, just substantive organizing in those communities. And again, this is organizing that you're going to need not just, a month before the election, right, but just having a presence. And it doesn't seem like the Democratic leadership in the state or in the city really understood that. Most of the community organizers, of course, like they see it every day. And there was less kind of finger pointing and vilifying people for not wanting to be engaged and saying, what are the substantive economic policies that you're going to bring forward to excite people? Just again, to shout out Georgia, that's something that Stacey Abrams has been doing. And so I want to mention her too, because I think that's an excellent contrast between what's been happening in 2016 and what can happen in the near future if we're looking at, ways to look ahead for progressives and for Black people and to resolve some of these economic insecurities that they're experiencing. She excited people, but she didn't just excite them by saying, hey, I'm a Black lady, vote for me. She was going around these communities and saying, we need a living wage. I'm going to expand Medicare. We're going to bring collective bargaining to Georgia, which is something you don't do in Georgia. It's a right to work state. It's Republican controlled. So they were framing her as radical, and she was deliberately positioning herself against a white Democratic candidate who she easily could have kind of pandered to the center because she's already Black. So that's radical. And just being a Black woman, natural hair, that's radical enough, but she didn't back down. And despite having, a more centrist white candidate, she blew her away in the primaries. So I think that is like a good next step to have. And, there is this kind of contrast between what's happening in Democratic national leadership, I think the mainstream, machinery versus what's happening with people who identify as Democrats, but they kind of operate independently from whatever their platform might be.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, to what extent, like, I've gotten really annoyed with this class versus identity debate because I just think it's stupid, and I don't think it really answers anything. Right?
Yeah, it is.
My only concern right now is I feel like, and I want to run this by you, is I feel like, okay, there's no doubt that following the Clinton campaign, that there's people, whether they're mediocre mainstream pundits or whether they're overcompensated mediocre Democratic consultants, and whether it's because they're running campaigns that rely on corporate money or they're just insulated media professionals that have no connection to real life, they're very happy to run this scenario out, which is like it's all a limited set of identity issues, and discussing economics and class is, a distraction, or you're really just like, Bernie bro or whatever. On the other hand,
which I have been called, by the way.
I'm sure you have.
Okay, you guys, calm down. Anyway.
That's why I had you on the show. I only have Bernie bro.
Yeah.
Guests.
It's a reunion.
Yeah. We only have. Yeah, I remember when, I shouldn't say this, but we met we were participating in a targeted harassment campaign on Twitter together.
Yeah.
I remember, Malaika,
I remember that very clearly.
Yeah, Malaika was, she was sending screenshots of Malcolm X to Amanda Marcotte, and it was very triggering.
Yeah.
But, one love. But then on the other hand, I think that there are some people that have taken, on the flip side, they've sort of skipped what your reporting illustrates, which is, regardless of political strategy, what this country needs is social democracy, period. And basically 99% need it. But in fact, disproportionately, people of color need it. And there's no contradiction between that and dealing with policing and anything to do with justice and emancipation. And I think that some people, by getting so fixated on this like mythical Trump voter that is more like in their heads than in reality, like they're like, oh, we're going to go and we're going to talk to some Trump voter who has like a swastika, and then we're going to say, but what about free college? And then all of a sudden they're going to like put on Pete Seeger music and hug us. And it's like, That's not what's happening. Most Trump voters are absolutely motivated by race, xenophobia, gender, and they are doing white identity politics because that's the Republican Party. And somehow I just can we just cut a lane where it's like, don't worry about all of these bullshit, Democrat, technocratic people who are going to use identity politics to undermine progress or knock off Caldor identity politics. But then on the other hand, don't fall into the trap of romanticizing this Trump voter or arguing against identity politics in a way that toxifies our brand as leftists. That's what worries me.
Yeah. I have nothing that I need to add, but I will add to it because
add
that's
everything.
perfect.
Yeah.
That's literally kind of been my stance. I get it. All of us are suffering under capitalism. There's no doubt about it. We have tried to, by we, I mean just the general, I consider myself radical. The radicals and the leftists have been trying to convince.
The Bernie bros, if you will.
Have been trying to convince, racist white people of that for centuries, probably. And I think a lot of them like being racist. I think they enjoy the sense of power that it gives them to feel that they've got, some sort of hold over another demographic. That's just how their minds work. At the same time, again, because capitalism does involve all of us and it implicates everyone, how do we navigate that? And I think that is a little bit tricky, but we've got more than enough Black people who are suffering, more than enough non-racist white people who voted for Obama, legit voted for Obama, who probably, just stuck out this last election because they don't want either Trump or Hillary Clinton. We've got enough, Latino voters. We've got more than enough people who are oppressed economically and socially that we can be targeting. So, I actually did some campaigning. Speaking of Bernie, I did some campaigning, and this was in 2016 when we were trying to get Bernie to win Michigan. I am an activist, so I'm a non-traditional, I wouldn't say I'm really a journalist per se, I'm a writer. Because my whole goal is to be involved with communities and to do activism.
It's like me. I'm really a talk show host / Bernie bro.
Yeah, theme of the night, guys. Yeah. We're all Bernie bros. And we were...
Don't act like that isn't going to get another call back. All right, but keep going.
So I was talking to a voter who voted for Obama. And so it does exist. It's a thing. And she was contemplating waffling between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. And so I had to, give her my spiel. And she was like, okay, Bernie Sanders has my vote. So those people exist. They are swing voters. That is a thing. But I think Democrats, they tend to, just historically speaking, at least for the last maybe 40 or 50 years, they tend to think of identity as mutually exclusive from economic appeals. Right. So when they were trying to find their identity after Robert Kennedy's assassination, they swung all the way to just kind of identity exclusively. When they realized, okay, we lost the white vote to Richard Nixon, there's nothing we can do to get them back. We don't need to really talk about economics or economic justice or anything that could really appeal to them. And that framing is completely backwards. You've got these pendulum shifts or swings where you're going kind of between these white economic voters or relying on this economic justice platform for them, or you're excluding Black people, or you're talking about Black people and not really including people of all races who are dealing with economic injustice. So that is a key. That's going to be debilitating for Democrats for the immediate future if they don't get a hold of that, particularly on a national level, and they don't hold on to that conversation, hold on to that narrative the way that Donald Trump has successfully done. So I think they need to look at people, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, look at her win and Stacey Abrams' win as some models, because it can happen, other than Brian Kemp being an asshole and definitely stealing the election.
Yeah, we're going to actually have in the post game a guy who is an organizer for Vote Georgia is going to call in with an update on that. We're going to do some more talking about that. But just another follow-up. So I think that's absolutely true. And I think there's no, again, people need to get really real about the data that's accumulating about the Trump voter profile out of this election. And again, in some ways, as we keep saying, they're Republicans. It's not really that sophisticated, but whatever. But I do think in the long term, it's very dangerous that Democrats created a brand where they associated racial and gender progress with trash economics. I think that's really dangerous. And if those two things, because I do think that what some of this sort of resurgence of like alt-right things, I think that some of what's happening is that some of these, like, say very specifically, like say middle-class white guys are recognizing that actually in today's global economy, the way the economy is structured, you can't actually just get a free ride as a middle-class white guy anymore. You can't. It's just not the way it's structured. And so instead of going to socialism, they're going to like, well, what was the time where that shit was guaranteed? And that's an interest in things like apartheid politics, in my opinion, because that is when you had capitalism that was structured so that it was just completely racially insulated, right? So I think like in the long term, not election cycle by election cycle, but over the span of decades, if in people's minds they're always like, well, the party that is right on, you know, even just like gay rights and marriage equality is also the one that's saying like, fuck you, like, you don't code, you're useless. That toxifies progress in people's minds in a way. And I do think that's a longer term problem.
Yeah. I mean, and I think it's also kind of an immediate problem in the sense that there are a lot of black voters who are already disillusioned.
Oh, well, definitely. I'm talking about the white people.
Okay, so white folks.
There's no, white people take, that's why I said long term. It takes a little bit longer.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of thinking about that too. I was walking around on my lunch break, just randomly thinking about the future of capitalism in America. And it's a steady decline.
Right.
And we've been experiencing it first. You know how they say when America catches a cold, black people get the flu. Yep. So there's evidence of this already amongst us, and these are people who are, you know, staunchly Democrats. So if you can lose these people, imagine what happens with, you know, the general, you know, electoral body. Yeah. When you start seeing the ways that, I mean, you guys were talking about it, like New York City is getting more and more empty. We've got Long Island City that's going to be overrun by these tech bros. I love some of my tech bros. I dated a tech bro. Like, I get it.
Like a tech bro.
Who I also think was a little bit libertarian.
Was it
I was like,
a libertarian?
I kind of
I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen. The interview's over.
I'm
going to kindly ask you to leave.
I shouldn't be talking about him because he's great.
I was simply trying to fix the culture in many ways.
You put on your headphones. Yeah, you just got owned by a sound drop. You gotta get your headphones on.
You missed the James Damore
My
drop.
bad.
Yeah, this is your ex-boyfriend, right?
I was simply trying to fix the culture in many ways.
Who's that?
That's the James Damore, the Google guy.
What Google guy? There's so many
Google
guys.
He did the Google memo that he got him fired.
For the sexual discrimination.
He said girls couldn't do computer coding. Yeah. He also dated you.
Him.
He dated you for a while.
Oh my God. I haven't heard that voice in so long.
Yeah. Should I order caviar?
So yeah, I mean, like Manhattan is just getting more and more, just unlivable for people who are even making six figures. So where are people going to go? What's going to happen? And that's across the board. So, black folks, we've been leaving for decades, the reverse migration back to, my city of Atlanta and, throughout the South. So what's going to happen with the rest of the country?
Final question before we go to the post game. To what extent, another thing I really liked about your piece, and I always so even it's just talking about like the black vote as one monolithic thing, and I'm not even saying I'm not making some PC point like, oh no, you can't. It's like, no, literally, like even in New York City, like the political tradition of Harlem is really different than Brooklyn, because there's a difference if you came to New York from the South versus, a Caribbean community. Like there's different politics, there's different incentives, there's different, and so many in these conversations, not just because obviously I wanted to push back and defend Bernie as a Bernie bro, but it was also like literally, you're wrong. I mean, we see this. There's a breakdown with like older black voters prefer Clinton, younger black voters prefer Bernie. You point out the South with a certain social conservatism, which reflects, actually, in fact, all Southern voters and that's also changing. We see that with Stacey Abrams and Andrew Gillum. And then this like Midwest populist black labor tradition. So to what extent do we also just need to, like, of course there's a black vote and there's overall black interests and black threats, certainly from something like the Trump administration, but it seems like people need to start figuring out how to disaggregate like voters inside the black community, right? Having very different interests, different ideological traditions, different politics. Is that going to help us get where we need to go? And also campaigns not be fucking morons and go to Wisconsin?
Yeah, and I think it'll help, mainstream Democrats, even though I'm not shilling for them. I don't really care if they improve because we need to get them out. So they can keep losing if they like to. If they want to treat black people as a monolith, keep losing. That's cool.
Right.
And I think it's important for people who identify as leftists as well. So when you think of working class, this piece is to push back on the narrative that it is, exclusively white, that it erases black people who do have a tradition of, like, we talked about before, collective bargaining, where they come from, kind of this anti-establishment politics. If you want to win, then yes, you're going to need to target these voters, and not because, you just want their vote, but because they're suffering. A lot of these folks have been dealing with capitalism, deindustrialization. I framed the piece around a factory called A.O. Smith, which is like the prime example of what happens when there is outsourcing and this race to the bottom in corporate governance. So they moved their operations to Mexico. They moved their operations to China. There are no more jobs left. The jobs that did remain in Milwaukee, they moved to the suburbs. So if you are not recognizing, that, so many black people are in these manufacturing industries, then you're also not recognizing the policy issues that you're going to need to address, like mass transit. How do you get people from the center city to suburbs?
Free universal mass transit.
Yes.
That needs to be central.
How do you have mass transit in these neighborhoods how do you even address the things that are within your purview if you don't even realize that it's an issue to begin with? So that is
Joy
kind
Reid
of a
was
wake-up
talking
call.
about this the other day.
Of course she was, right?
Yeah. I love how the hate for Joy Reid is so heavy that people don't even do like the pause, like, really? She was talking about that? It's always like, yeah, of course she was.
Mm-hmm.
Fuck her.
Yeah, I think I refollowed her because of like one thing that I wanted to look at. I was like, okay, I'm done.
I think relative to most Bernie bros, I have been so easy on Joy Reid. It's amazing. People really don't like Joy Reid. I mean, she's trash. Don't get me wrong. I'm just like, whew.
It's MSNBC.
What was that Bernie Sanders thing she did about him being like a college guy?
He's a bad roommate.
He's a bad roommate.
Which, I mean, I don't know.
Hey, can I borrow your BitTorrent?
I swear I wasn't downloading.
I swear I was. Well, we have a strike notice from Verizon. It wasn't me. I'm tired of being blamed.
You think I'm the only one that downloads on this?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm the only guy because I'm the only one that's torrenting. Fuck you. All right.
If Joy Reid was doing that, that'd be good.
If Joy Reid was doing a solid Bernie impression about him stealing Netflix passwords, I would give her a pass every single day. That's the type of broadcast talent that goes a long way with me. It's the same reason I like Alex Jones. All right. Remember when we betted Alex Jones dissing Ben Shapiro and we betted ether under it and it worked?
I don't even remember why he dissed Ben Shapiro.
Oh, because Ben Shapiro's whack. He put out a track on Ben Shapiro and we betted ether under it and it worked. It actually flowed.
Betted ether? I think this is like next level Bernie, bro. I'm not like all the way there. What is this? I'm curious.
So ether, Nas's Jay-Z track.
Yes.
So we played
in studio audience.
Yeah, you don't even have to play the video. You can play it on audio. We did this.
Yeah, I don't have the ether on it though.
Oh, you don't have the ether on it?
Oh, you said you embedded.
We put the ether. We bedded the ether instrumental under. It's just we just played the.
Okay. Like
Jesus Christ.
Terminology.
It's Bernie bro inner sanctum terminology. No,
I see.
We just played the ether instrumental while Do you have this?
Where he tries to act scary and powerful.
See, it
he
works.
Recycles a bunch of libertarian conservative thought and a bunch of other think tanks.
Okay. Cipher.
Yeah, exactly. All right, we're going to go to the post game. Where there will be a lot more of that type of thing.
Are we freestyling too?
We're going to freestyle
I'm
in the
kidding.
post game.
That's not happening. I thought I was on Sway. This isn't Sway?
Oh, really? You're not going to freestyle? I'm just fucking with you. All right. We're going to go to the... We do. We have a lot of beats. DJ Anarchy has beats.
Definitely not happening.
You said that you wanted to do a spoken word about Cynthia McKinney before the show. So that's
And
cool.
Joy-Ann
Yeah. And Joy-Ann Reid.
Yeah.
Joy, you know what? One of the last thing I will say.
Joy-Ann Reid diss track would be good for YouTube.
It would be very good for YouTube.
Yeah,
if you'd like to
that's
do that,
not
we will. Yeah. Let me just say this though.
Never mind.
I respect the hell out of Joy Reid's game, like that. She was just like, "Yep, Russians wrote that shit," and she just stood by it. How can you not respect that?
That is, we do need more of that.
We need a lot more of that. She's just like, "Yep, that's right," because the Russians, they went back to Florida.
Russia's hacked the Wayback Machine.
Like the fucking, like Putin was like, one day she will be important MSNBC commentators. So, and then America will have big progress for gays, and then there will be a thing called Twitter where people freak out every single second. But she will be part of the people that freak out for every single second. We'll undermine
Hypocrisy.
her with, yes, by your own logic. And then she's just like, yeah, that's exactly what happens, and I'm not resigning. And everybody else is just like, all right.
Fair enough.
I didn't
Fair
realize I
enough.
was on like the impression hour. Like I wish I came ready.
Oh,
you
yeah.
don't have any impressions?
No, I didn't come ready with any.
How do you
I'll prepare
ready?
next time.
What are you going to prepare? What are you thinking?
All right. I don't know. I got to think about it. I wasn't prepared.
Prepare for the impression hour. We're going to go to the post game. Malaika is going to stick with us, read her piece, The Color of Economic Anxiety in Current Affairs. It's an excellent piece, indispensable.
Can they follow me on Twitter?
Of course, they can follow you on Twitter. There's going to be links to every way that you can follow Malaika in the show notes. We could also throw it. Do you have it up? We could throw it up on screen. Become a patron of the Michael Brooks Show today. We are continuing to grow at a really fast clip. And we talked about the illicit histories, the post games, all the things, the Discord communities, the calls with me, all the things you get as a patron. Patreon.com/TMBS. And we will see you February 1st at the Bell House for our first live show. Get your tickets now. We'll see you in a couple in the post game. Thank you to super producer Matt Leck, chief economist David Griscom, super producer David Slavic, the entire TMBS community, and Malaika Jabali for being here. We'll see you in the post game, patrons.